the entire story of human civilization history for sleep. Good evening, and welcome back to another journey through time. Tonight, we're going to travel together through the complete story of human civilization, from the very first flickering campfires under ancient skies to the glowing screens of the modern world. This is a story that spans hundreds of thousands of years, yet it unfolds with a quiet patience that matches the rhythm of your breathing as you settle into rest. Whether you're lying in bed after a long day, seeking comfort in the familiar voice of history, or simply curious about the long and winding path that brought us to this moment, I'm glad you're here. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Are you watching the stars appear outside your window, or listening as dawn approaches? Wherever you are, whatever hour finds you, let's begin this gentle journey together. Now, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's go back to the very beginning. The dawn of humanity. Long before there were cities or kingdoms, before there were words written on clay or stone, before there were roads or borders or names for the lands beneath our feet, there were people. They were not so different from us, these early humans. They felt the cold of winter nights and the warmth of summer days. They knew hunger and satisfaction, fear and comfort, loneliness and love. But their world was vast and wild in ways we can barely imagine now. Picture the African savanna 300,000 years ago. The sky stretches endlessly overhead, deeper and more crowded with stars than any sky you've ever seen. There are no city lights to dim their brilliance, no glow on the horizon to blur the edge between earth and heaven. The Milky Way flows like a river of light across the darkness, and beneath it, small groups of humans huddle around fires that push back the night. These early people, our ancestors, lived lives of profound simplicity and equally profound complexity. They were Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, and they had emerged in East Africa after millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Their brains were as large and capable as ours. They could think, plan, dream, and imagine. But their world moved at a different pace, measured not in seconds and minutes, but in seasons and generations. During the day they walked. They walked along game trails and through tall grass, following the migrations of animals and the ripening of wild fruits. They knew the landscape intimately, reading it like we read books, understanding which plants could heal and which could harm, where water could be found when the dry season stretched on, and where dangerous predators liked to rest in the heat of the afternoon. This knowledge was survival, passed down through careful teaching and watchful imitation. The women gathered. They collected tubers and roots, digging them from the earth with pointed sticks. They gathered nuts and seeds, berries and fruits, edible leaves and mushrooms. They knew the seasons of each plant, knew when to harvest and when to leave them alone. They carried their children with them, infants bound close to their bodies, toddlers learning to walk alongside, older children helping with the gathering, absorbing the knowledge they would need to survive. The men hunted, though not as we might imagine from movies or dramatic paintings. Hunting was not usually a violent, adrenaline-fueled chase. It was patient. It was walking for hours, sometimes days, tracking an animal by the faintest signs. A bent blade of grass, a disturbance in the dust, the smell carried on the wind. It was understanding the behavior of prey, knowing where they would go to drink, where they would rest, how they would react to danger. And when the moment finally came, it was quick and efficient, a thrown spear or a stone, meat that would feed the group for days. At night, they gathered around the fire. Fire was perhaps humanity's first great invention, or perhaps it was a gift stolen from lightning strikes and carefully preserved. Either way, it changed everything. Fire provided warmth on cold nights, protection from predators who feared the flames, and a way to cook food that made it safer and more nutritious. But fire did something else too. It created a center, a place where people gathered not just for survival but for connection. Around these fires, language evolved. At first, perhaps it was simple. Sounds that meant danger, sounds that meant food, sounds that meant come here or stay away. But slowly, over thousands of generations, language became more complex. People began to tell stories. They shared knowledge about where food could be found, about dangers they had encountered, about the nature of the world around them. They gossiped about each other, forming the social bonds that held their small groups together. They sang, creating rhythms that matched their heartbeats and melodies that echoed the sounds of the natural world. They also created art. In caves across Africa and Europe, early humans left their marks. They painted the animals they hunted and the animals they feared. They pressed their hands against cave walls and blew pigment around them, leaving negative images that seemed to call across the millennia. I was here. I existed. Remember me. These were not just decorations. They were part of humanity's emerging relationship with the symbolic, with the idea that something could represent something else, that a mark on a wall could carry meaning beyond itself. Life was hard, of course. Infant mortality was high. Injuries that we would consider minor could become fatal. Hunger was a constant companion during lean seasons. The average lifespan was perhaps 35 years, though those who survived childhood often lived much longer. But there was also beauty. There was the satisfaction of a successful hunt, the joy of a child's laughter, the comfort of being known and accepted by your group. There was the magnificence of a sunset, the refreshment of a cool stream on a hot day, the security of falling asleep surrounded by people who knew your name. For hundreds of thousands of years, this was the human story. Small groups, rarely more than 50 or 100 people, moving slowly across vast landscapes. They lived in balance with their environment, taking what they needed but not more, following the ancient rhythms of nature. They spread gradually out of Africa, moving north into the Middle East and Europe, east into Asia, eventually crossing land bridges and navigating waters to reach Australia and the Americas. This migration took tens of thousands of years. No single person set out to explore the world. Instead, generation after generation moved just a little farther, following game or fleeing drought, seeking new territory when the old became too crowded. Everywhere they went, humans adapted. In the cold north, they learned to hunt mammoth and reindeer, to sew warm clothing from hides, to build shelters from bones and tusks. Along coasts, they became skilled fishers, learning to read the tides and understand the seasons of the sea. In forests, they developed different tools and techniques. In deserts, they found ways to survive on minimal water, knowing every hidden spring and seep. Humans proved to be the most adaptable species on Earth, capable of thriving in almost any environment not through physical specialization but through cultural innovation and learning. And so the world filled, slowly, with people. By 12,000 years ago, humans had reached every continent except Antarctica. They spoke thousands of different languages and had developed thousands of different cultures, each adapted to local conditions, each with its own songs and stories, its own ways of making sense of the world. They were still hunter-gatherers, still living in small mobile groups. But something was about to change, something that would alter the human story more profoundly than anything that had come before. The Ice Age was ending. The great glaciers that had covered much of the northern hemisphere were melting, raising sea levels and creating new coastlines. The climate was warming, becoming more stable and predictable. And in several places around the world, almost simultaneously in historical terms, humans began to do something new. They began to settle down. They began to plant seeds and harvest crops. They began to domesticate animals. They began, slowly and without knowing where it would lead, to invent civilization. The birth of civilization. The change happened in river valleys. This is not a coincidence. Rivers provided everything early farmers needed: water for crops, rich soil deposited by annual floods, fish to supplement their diet, and transportation routes for moving goods and ideas. Around the world, in places that had little contact with each other, humans independently discovered that they could control their food supply instead of simply following it. In the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria to the Mediterranean coast, people began cultivating wheat and barley. They domesticated sheep and goats, pigs and cattle. In China, along the Yellow River and the Yangtze, farmers grew millet and rice, raised pigs and chickens. In Mesoamerica, they cultivated maize, beans, and squash. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa. In New Guinea, taro and bananas. Each region developed its own suite of crops and animals, but the pattern was the same. People were taking control of nature, bending it to serve human needs. This was the Neolithic Revolution, though revolution is perhaps too dramatic a word for a process that unfolded over thousands of years. A person living at the beginning of this change would not have noticed anything revolutionary. They might have planted a few seeds near their campsite, returning to harvest them later. They might have kept a few wild sheep enclosed, finding them easier to hunt that way. But generation by generation, the changes accumulated. Plants that produced larger seeds were preferentially replanted. Animals that were more docile were more likely to breed. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, wild species became domesticated, and humans became farmers. The consequences were enormous. Farming produced more food per acre than hunting and gathering, which meant the land could support more people. Villages grew into towns. But farming was also more labor-intensive and less varied in diet. Farmers worked harder than hunter-gatherers and were often less healthy, more prone to disease and malnutrition. Yet farming had one overwhelming advantage. It produced surpluses. For the first time in human history, it was possible to store food, to save it for lean times or trade it for other goods. And surpluses allowed some people to do things other than produce food. Along the Nile River in Egypt, farming communities appeared around 5000 BC. The Nile was generous, flooding predictably every year and leaving behind rich black soil. Farmers planted wheat and barley in this gift from the river, and the crops grew abundantly. Villages clustered along the riverbanks, and gradually these villages began to organize themselves, to cooperate on larger projects like irrigation canals that could extend the reach of the floodwaters. In Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now Iraq, a similar story unfolded. This was a harder land than Egypt, more unpredictable, requiring more effort to control the waters and make the desert bloom. But the people of Mesopotamia were persistent, and by 4000 BCE, true cities were emerging. Uruk, Ur, these names echo across the centuries, the world's first urban centers, home to tens of thousands of people. Cities changed everything. In a city, you had farmers, but you also had potters making vessels to store grain, weavers turning flax and wool into cloth, carpenters building houses, and metalworkers learning to smelt copper and later bronze. You had merchants trading goods, priests performing rituals to honor the gods, and administrators organizing the distribution of food and resources. For the first time, society became truly stratified. Some people had more than others. Some had power over others. Kings and queens emerged, claiming the right to rule, sometimes by force and sometimes by claiming divine sanction. Writing was invented to keep track of all this complexity. The earliest writing we know of comes from Mesopotamia around 3200 BC, simple marks pressed into clay tablets with a reed stylus. These first texts were not great literature or philosophical treatises. They were accounting records: how much grain was stored in the temple, how many sheep belonged to a particular merchant, who owed what to whom. But once writing existed, it expanded. People began to record laws and prayers, king lists and epic poems. The Sumerians, who inhabited southern Mesopotamia, created literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest stories, about a king searching for immortality and coming to terms with the inevitability of death. In the Indus Valley, in what is now Pakistan and northwest India, another early civilization flourished around 2500 BC. The Indus Valley cities, places like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, were marvels of urban planning. They had straight streets laid out in grids, sophisticated drainage systems, standardized weights and measures, and multi-story buildings made of fired brick. The people of the Indus Valley developed their own writing system, though we still cannot read it. Their civilization stretched across a vast area larger than ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, yet it seems to have been remarkably uniform, suggesting a degree of cultural cohesion or centralized control that we don't fully understand. In China, along the Yellow River, civilization coalesced somewhat later but with equal sophistication. By 1600 BC, the Shang dynasty ruled much of northern China, governing from impressive capital cities, casting elaborate ritual vessels in bronze, and developing an early form of Chinese writing on oracle bones, pieces of turtle shell or ox bone used in divination rituals. The questions inscribed on these bones give us glimpses into Shang concerns. Will the harvest be good? Should we attack our enemies? Will the ancestor spirits be pleased with our offerings? These early civilizations were not isolated. Trade networks emerged, carrying goods and ideas across vast distances. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan appeared in Mesopotamian jewelry. Mesopotamian designs influenced Egyptian art. Along rivers and coastlines, up mountains and across deserts, merchants traveled, carrying not just physical goods but stories and technologies, religious ideas and political innovations. The world was becoming connected, slowly, through these fragile threads of trade. But these early civilizations were also fragile. They depended on the reliability of rivers, on the continued fertility of soil, on the stability of climate. When rivers changed course, when droughts lasted too long, when social tensions built up beyond the breaking point, civilizations could collapse. The Indus Valley cities were abandoned around 1900 BC, perhaps due to climate change, perhaps due to earthquakes or invasions. We still don't fully know. Mesopotamian cities rose and fell as empires conquered and were conquered in turn. Egypt had periods of unity and periods of fragmentation, kingdoms rising and falling like the annual flooding of the Nile. Yet each collapse was also a transformation. Knowledge was not entirely lost. When one civilization fell, its ideas were often absorbed by its successors. Writing systems evolved and spread. Agricultural techniques improved. Metalworking advanced from copper to bronze to iron. Mathematics developed to measure fields and calculate taxes, to track the stars and predict the seasons. Astronomy emerged from the need to create calendars, to know when to plant and when to harvest, when to expect floods and when to prepare for drought. In these ancient cities, under the administration of priests and kings, Humanity was learning to organize itself in new ways. Laws were written down, like the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon around 1750 BCE, one of the earliest comprehensive legal codes. It prescribed specific punishments for specific crimes, establishing the principle that justice should be predictable and consistent, even if the actual laws seem harsh by modern standards. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, was not about vengeance but about proportionality, about ensuring that punishments didn't exceed the crime. Religion in these early civilizations was deeply woven into daily life. Gods were not abstract concepts but living presences who needed to be fed and housed and honored. Temples were the homes of gods, and priests were their servants, performing daily rituals, offering food and drink, reciting prayers and hymns. The gods controlled nature, the flooding of rivers, the fertility of fields, the movement of sun and stars. To keep the gods happy was to ensure the continued survival of the community. When disaster struck, it was understood as divine displeasure, and people looked to their priests and kings to restore the cosmic balance. Yet even in these ancient times, there was diversity in how people thought about the divine. The Mesopotamians imagined a pantheon of quarreling gods, each with their own domain and personality, reflecting perhaps the political instability of their region where city-states constantly competed. The Egyptians saw their gods as more stable, with the pharaoh himself as a living god, the link between heaven and earth, ensuring through his proper conduct that the Nile would flood and the sun would rise. The Chinese developed the concept of the mandate of heaven, the idea that rulers held power only as long as they governed well and justly, and that dynasties could lose this mandate if they became corrupt or incompetent. As centuries passed, these civilizations matured. They built monuments that still stand today, testaments to human ambition and engineering. The pyramids of Egypt rose from the desert sands, vast geometric mountains built to house the bodies of dead pharaohs and ensure their journey to the afterlife. The Great Pyramid of Giza, built around 2560 BCE for the pharaoh Khufu, remained the tallest human-made structure in the world for over 3,000 years. It required the labor of thousands of workers, not slaves as once thought, but skilled laborers and seasonal workers, fed and housed by the state, working in the service of their god-king and, in their minds, ensuring the stability of the cosmos itself. In Mesopotamia, ziggurats rose like stepped mountains, artificial peaks in the flat river plains, each a temple complex dedicated to a city's patron deity. In China, palace compounds grew ever more elaborate, surrounded by walls, organized according to precise principles of cosmology and geomancy, the earthly realm mirroring the heavenly order. The Shang kings built underground tombs filled with bronze vessels and oracle bones, sacrificed servants and horses and dogs, creating in death a court that would serve them in the afterlife. But life for most people remained grounded in simpler realities. Farmers still rose with the sun and worked until dusk, their lives following the eternal cycle of planting and harvest. They lived in small villages in houses of mud brick or wattle and daub, sleeping on mats, cooking over fires, wearing simple linen or wool garments. They paid taxes in grain, provided labor for state projects, and prayed to the gods for good harvests and healthy children. Their lives were hard but structured, part of a larger system that, for all its inequalities, provided a kind of security that hunter-gatherers had never known. Cities were centers of innovation, but they were also centers of disease. Living in close quarters with domestic animals, drinking from polluted water sources, disposing of waste inadequately, all of this created perfect conditions for epidemic diseases. Infectious diseases like smallpox, measles, and plague became endemic to civilized populations, killing many but also creating survivors with immunity. This would have enormous consequences later when civilizations came into contact with isolated populations who had no such immunity. Yet despite the hardships, despite the diseases and wars and inequalities, civilization grew. It spread up river valleys and along coastlines, into highlands and across plains. New cities emerged, new kingdoms rose, new ideas flourished. And everywhere, people were asking the same fundamental questions. Why are we here? What is the right way to live? What happens when we die? How should society be organized? What is justice? What is truth? These questions, as old as consciousness itself, were about to receive new and profound answers. Because as civilizations matured and became more secure, as surpluses grew and literacy spread, as trade networks expanded and ideas flowed more freely across borders, a new kind of human endeavor was emerging. Philosophy was being born, and with it would come some of the most enduring ideas humanity has ever produced, ideas that would shape civilizations for thousands of years and that still resonate in our world today. Ancient empires rise and fade. As the centuries unfolded and the first millennium BC began, the world was filling with kingdoms and empires, each rising from the foundations laid by earlier civilizations. These were not small city-states anymore, but vast territories united under single rulers, held together by armies and bureaucracies, roads and laws. They rose with the confidence of youth, convinced of their eternal permanence, and they fell as all things must, leaving behind ruins and memories and lessons for those who came after. In Egypt, the age of the pyramid builders had given way to the New Kingdom, a period of unprecedented wealth and power. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramesses II commanded armies that marched into Syria and Nubia, expanding Egyptian control and bringing back tribute of gold and slaves, exotic animals and precious woods. The temples grew ever more magnificent. At Karnak, the great hypostyle hall rose with its forest of columns, each massive enough that 100 men could stand on its capital. Light filtered through high clear-story windows, creating an atmosphere of divine mystery where priests performed their secret rituals. But Egypt, for all its grandeur, was entering a long decline. The Sea Peoples came, mysterious invaders whose origin we still debate, disrupting trade routes and weakening kingdoms throughout the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Egypt survived but was diminished. The third intermediate period saw the kingdom fragment into competing dynasties. Foreign powers, Libyans, Nubians, Assyrians, Persians, would successively rule the ancient land of the pharaohs. The glory days were becoming memory, and memory was becoming myth. To the east, in Mesopotamia, empires rose and fell with even greater frequency. The Assyrians built a military machine of terrifying efficiency, conquering from Egypt to Persia, ruling through fear and deportation, relocating conquered peoples to prevent rebellion. Their capital at Nineveh was a wonder, its walls so thick that chariots could race along the top, its libraries containing thousands of clay tablets, the accumulated knowledge of Mesopotamian civilization. When Nineveh fell to the combined forces of Babylonians and Medes in 612 BC, it burned so fiercely that the clay tablets were baked hard, accidentally preserving them for modern archaeologists to discover. The Babylonians briefly reclaimed their ancient glory under Nebuchadnezzar II, who rebuilt Babylon into a city of legend. The Hanging Gardens, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, supposedly cascaded with greenery and flowers, an artificial paradise built to please a homesick queen. The Ishtar Gate, decorated with brilliant blue glazed bricks and golden lions and dragons, was the ceremonial entrance to the city, a statement of power and aesthetic sophistication. But this Neo-Babylonian empire lasted less than a century before falling to the Persians in 539 BC. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great and his successors became the largest empire the world had yet seen, stretching from Egypt to India, from the Aegean Sea to Central Asia. Unlike earlier conquerors, the Persians practiced relative tolerance, allowing conquered peoples to keep their customs and religions as long as they paid taxes and acknowledged Persian sovereignty. The Persian royal road connected the empire, allowing messages to travel from Sardis to Susa in days rather than months, an early version of the infrastructure that all successful empires require. The Emperor Darius I instituted a standardized currency, a legal code applied throughout the empire, and a postal system. He built Persepolis, a ceremonial capital of stunning beauty, where representatives from all the subject peoples would come each spring to bring tribute and reaffirm their loyalty. Far to the east, China was experiencing its own period of transformation and turmoil. The Zhou dynasty, which had overthrown the Shang around 1046 BCE, claimed to rule by the mandate of heaven, but by the 8th century BCE, the Zhou kings had become figureheads. Real power lay with regional lords who competed for supremacy. This period, known as the Spring and Autumn period followed by the Warring States period, was a time of almost constant warfare. Yet it was also a time of unprecedented intellectual ferment. From this chaos would emerge some of China's most influential philosophies. In India, the Vedic civilization had spread across northern India, bringing with it the Sanskrit language and the Vedic texts, ancient hymns and rituals that would form the basis of Hinduism. Society was organizing itself according to the Varna system, the division into priests, warriors, merchants, and laborers that would eventually harden into the caste system. City-states emerged along the Gangetic Plain, growing wealthy from agriculture and trade. It was a world in transition, moving from tribal society to complex kingdoms, from oral tradition to written texts, from simple rituals to sophisticated philosophy. In the Americas, civilizations were developing independently, following their own trajectories. The Olmec, that mysterious mother culture of Mesoamerica, had already risen and fallen, leaving behind colossal stone heads and the foundations of the cultural patterns that would characterize the region: the ball game, the stepped pyramid, the concept of ritual bloodletting, the sacred calendar. Their successors were building on this foundation. The Zapotec were developing one of the earliest writing systems in the Americas at Monte Alban. The Maya were beginning their rise in the lowlands of Guatemala and the Yucatan Peninsula, building cities that would eventually number in the hundreds, creating a complex hieroglyphic script and making astronomical observations of stunning accuracy. In South America, complex societies were emerging in the Andes. The Chavan culture, centered in the highlands of Peru, was spreading its religious influence widely, its art style characterized by fang deities and transforming figures, reminiscent in some ways of the Olmec war jaguar. Along the coast, other cultures like the Paracas were producing some of the world's finest textiles, weaving intricate patterns in brilliant colors that have survived in the dry coastal tombs. But let us return to the Old World, because it is here, in the middle of the first millennium BCE, that something remarkable was happening. Across a wide belt from the Mediterranean to China, seemingly independently yet almost simultaneously, new ways of thinking were emerging. This was the Axial Age, a term coined by the philosopher Karl Jaspers to describe the period from roughly 800 to 200 BCE when the foundations of modern thought were laid. In this period, thinkers began to question traditional answers and seek deeper truths. They asked not just how to appease the gods, but what is truly good, truly just, truly real. They developed universal principles that transcended tribal loyalties and local customs. They taught compassion, self-cultivation, and the examined life. And their teachings would shape human civilization for the next 2.5 millennia. Philosophy, religion, and thought. In the foothills of the Himalayas in what is now Nepal, a prince named Siddhartha Gautama sat beneath a fig tree and refused to rise until he understood the nature of suffering and how to escape it. This was around 500 BC, give or take a few decades. The exact dates are uncertain, lost in the mists of time and legend. Siddhartha had been raised in luxury, sheltered from the harsh realities of life, but when he ventured outside the palace walls as a young man, he encountered an old man, a sick man, a corpse, and a wandering ascetic. These foresights awakened him to the universality of suffering and set him on a spiritual quest. For years, he practiced extreme asceticism, nearly starving himself to death in pursuit of enlightenment. But he found no answers in self-mortification. So he chose a middle way, neither indulgence nor extreme denial, and sitting in meditation beneath that tree, later called the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, he achieved enlightenment. He understood the Four Noble Truths, that life contains suffering, that suffering arises from attachment and desire, that it is possible to end suffering, and that the way to end suffering is through the eightfold path of right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The Buddha, as he came to be known, the awakened one, spent the rest of his life teaching. He wandered through northern India with a growing group of followers, teaching a path that required no priests, no sacrifices, no complex rituals. It was a remarkably democratic teaching for its time, open to people of all castes, even to women, in a society that was becoming increasingly hierarchical. The Buddha taught that each person must work out their own salvation, that no God could grant it, that the answers lay within through discipline and understanding. Around the same time in China, another teacher was also reshaping how people thought about life and society. Confucius, born Kongfuzi around 551 BC, lived during the chaotic spring and autumn period when the old certainties of the Zhou dynasty were collapsing. Unlike the Buddha, who focused on escaping suffering through detachment, Confucius focused on creating a harmonious society through proper conduct and relationships. Confucius taught that society functions best when everyone fulfills their role with integrity and righteousness. He emphasized 5 key relationships: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, older and younger siblings, friend and friend. In each relationship, both parties had duties. A ruler must be just and benevolent. Subjects must be loyal and obedient. A father must be caring. A son must be filial. These were not just rules but ideals to strive for, patterns that, if followed, would create a harmonious society where everyone knew their place and fulfilled it willingly. Central to Confucian thought was the concept of ren, often translated as benevolence or humaneness, a quality of compassion and empathy that should guide all human interactions. Also important was li, propriety or ritual correctness, the idea that how we do things matters as much as what we do. By performing rituals properly, by observing etiquette and social norms, we cultivate virtue and maintain social harmony. Confucius looked back to an idealized past, to the early Zhou dynasty, as a model of good governance and social order, and he believed that by recovering ancient wisdom, society could be restored to health. Confucius spent much of his life trying to convince rulers to adopt his principles, but he was largely unsuccessful in his lifetime. He held minor government positions but never achieved real political power. Instead, he became a teacher, gathering disciples who would preserve and spread his teachings. The Analects, a collection of his sayings and conversations recorded by his students, would become one of the most influential books in human history, shaping Chinese civilization and spreading throughout East Asia to Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. While the Buddha and Confucius were teaching in the East, a different kind of revolution in thought was happening in the West, in the Greek world. Greece was not a unified country but a collection of independent city-states scattered around the Aegean Sea and beyond, each with its own government and character. Some, like Sparta, were rigid military oligarchies. Others, like Athens, were experimenting with democracy, not democracy as we know it, where all adults can vote, but a limited democracy where free male citizens could participate in governance. In these Greek city-states, particularly in Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor, thinkers began to ask new kinds of questions. Instead of accepting traditional mythological explanations for natural phenomena, they sought natural causes. Thales of Miletus proposed that water was the fundamental substance underlying all reality. Heraclitus taught that change was the only constant, that you could never step in the same river twice. Pythagoras discovered mathematical relationships in music and geometry and founded a philosophical and religious movement based on the transmigration of souls. But the truly revolutionary development in Greek thought came in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE with three successive thinkers: Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Socrates, who wrote nothing himself but is known through the writings of his student Plato, spent his days in the agora of Athens questioning people who claimed to know things. He would ask them to define justice, or courage, or piety, and then through careful questioning would reveal that their definitions were inconsistent or incomplete. His method, now called the Socratic method, was designed not to humiliate but to awaken, to show people that true wisdom begins with recognizing one's own ignorance. Socrates believed that virtue is knowledge, that if people truly understood what was good, they would do it. Evil comes from ignorance, not malice. He also taught that the unexamined life is not worth living, that we have a duty to question our assumptions and beliefs, to think critically about how we live and why. This made him unpopular with many Athenians, and eventually he was tried and condemned to death on charges of corrupting the youth and impiety. He accepted his sentence calmly and drank the hemlock, becoming a martyr to philosophy and free thought. Plato, devastated by his teacher's death, devoted his life to preserving Socratic philosophy and developing it further. He founded the Academy in Athens, one of the first institutions of higher learning in the Western world, where students came to study mathematics, astronomy, and philosophy. In his dialogues, philosophical works written as conversations, usually featuring Socrates as the main character, Plato explored questions of justice, knowledge, reality, and the ideal state. Plato's most famous idea is his theory of forms. He argued that the physical world we experience with our senses is not the true reality but merely a shadow of it. The true reality consists of perfect, eternal, unchanging forms or ideas. The many individual beautiful things we see are beautiful only because they participate in the form of beauty. Individual just acts are just because they participate in the form of justice. The philosopher's task is to move beyond the shadows and grasp these eternal truths through reason and contemplation. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, took philosophy in a more empirical direction. While Plato looked to an eternal realm of forms, Aristotle looked to the world around him. He was a systematic thinker who wrote on an astonishing range of subjects: logic, physics, biology, ethics, politics, poetry, and more. He founded the Lyceum in Athens, a rival to Plato's Academy, and sent his students out to collect specimens and data, compiling what amounted to encyclopedias of knowledge. In ethics, Aristotle taught the doctrine of the mean, that virtue lies between extremes. Courage, for example, is the mean between cowardice and recklessness. The goal of life is eudaimonia, often translated as happiness but perhaps better understood as flourishing or living well. We achieve this through cultivating virtues and exercising reason, which Aristotle believed was the distinctive human capacity. These Greek philosophers were asking questions that remain central to human thought. What can we know and how can we know it? What is the good life? What makes a state just? What is the nature of reality? Their answers differed, but their method, careful, rational inquiry, willingness to follow arguments wherever they lead, emphasis on consistency and logical rigor, established a pattern of thinking that would profoundly influence Western civilization. Meanwhile, in other parts of the Greek world, other important developments were occurring. The historian Herodotus was traveling throughout the known world and recording the histories and customs of different peoples, becoming the father of history. Thucydides was writing his account of the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, pioneering a more analytical and evidence-based approach to history. Greek playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, were exploring timeless human themes of fate, justice, pride, and suffering in their tragedies, while comedians like Aristophanes were using humor to comment on contemporary politics and society. Back in China, Confucianism was just one of many competing philosophies. The Warring States period was so intellectually vibrant that Chinese scholars call it the 100 Schools of Thought. Alongside Confucianism, there was Taoism, traditionally attributed to a mysterious figure called Laozi. The Daedejing, the foundational Taoist text, taught that there is a way, Tao, underlying all reality, a natural order that things follow when not interfered with. The wise person lives in harmony with this way, practicing Wu Wei, effort. Non-action or effortless action, going with the flow rather than struggling against it. Where Confucius emphasized social relationships and proper conduct, Taoists emphasized simplicity, spontaneity, and connection with nature. They were skeptical of government and social conventions, seeing them as artificial constructs that distorted human nature. The ideal was to live simply and naturally, like water that flows around obstacles without forcing, that is soft and yielding yet capable of wearing away the hardest stone. Another influential Chinese philosophy was legalism, which took a much harsher view of human nature and governance. The legalists believed that people are fundamentally selfish and will only behave properly if compelled by strict laws and harsh punishments. They advocated for a strong centralized state with absolute power concentrated in the ruler, enforced by a complex system of rewards and punishments. While Confucians and Taoists disagreed about many things, they both found legalism too cynical and brutal. Yet it was legalism that would help unify China under the Qin dynasty, though that dynasty would be short-lived partly because of its harshness. In India, alongside Buddhism, other philosophical and religious movements were emerging. Jainism, founded by Mahavira, a contemporary of the Buddha, taught an even more rigorous path of nonviolence and asceticism. Jains went to great lengths to avoid harming any living being, even insects, sweeping the path before them and wearing masks to avoid accidentally inhaling and killing tiny creatures. They believed in the immortality and transmigration of souls and taught that liberation came through eliminating karma through right conduct and austerity. The Upanishads, philosophical texts that formed the culmination of Vedic thought, were being composed. These explored the relationship between Atman, the individual soul, and Brahman, the universal soul or ultimate reality, teaching that they were ultimately identical. Tattvam Aci, the Upanishads declare that thou art. The individual self and the cosmic self are one. Understanding this truth through meditation and knowledge leads to moksha, liberation from the cycle of death and rebirth. In the Middle East, a different kind of revolution was occurring. The Jewish people who had been exiled to Babylon after the destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BCE were developing a more mature and universalistic understanding of their faith during this exile. The prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, were calling for social justice, ethical behavior, and a return to covenant faithfulness. They taught that God cared about how people treated each other, especially the poor and vulnerable, not just about ritual observance. When the Persians conquered Babylon and allowed the Jews to return home, they brought with them texts and traditions that would be compiled into the Hebrew Bible, the foundational document of Judaism and later Christianity. The Persian Empire itself had developed Zoroastrianism, a religion founded by the prophet Zarathustra, Zoroaster in Greek. Zoroastrianism was perhaps the first truly monotheistic religion, teaching that there was one supreme God, Ahura Mazda, the creator of all that is good, locked in a cosmic struggle with Indra Manu, the destructive spirit. Humans must choose which side to support through their thoughts, words, and deeds. Good would ultimately triumph, and there would be a final judgment where the righteous would be rewarded and the wicked punished. These ideas, monotheism, cosmic dualism, final judgment, heaven and hell, would profoundly influence later religions, particularly Christianity and Islam. What united all these diverse philosophical and religious movements of the axial age was a shift in consciousness. People were moving beyond seeing the divine as simply powerful beings to be appeased through sacrifice. They were developing universal ethical principles, asking about the nature of reality and the self, contemplating the possibility of transcendence. They were, in a sense, becoming more reflective, more self-aware, more concerned with inner transformation as much as outer conformity. These ideas did not remain confined to the places where they originated. They spread along trade routes, carried by merchants and missionaries, scholars and soldiers. Buddhism spread from India throughout Asia, adapting to local cultures, eventually reaching China, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Confucianism became the official ideology of the Chinese state and spread to neighboring countries. Greek philosophy would be carried by Alexander the Great's conquests and would eventually merge with Christian theology to shape medieval European thought. These ideas were humanity's inheritance, tools for making sense of existence, for finding meaning and purpose, for living well. But ideas do not exist in a vacuum. They arise in specific historical contexts, and they interact with the messy realities of politics and economics, war and peace, rise and fall of empires. As we move forward in time, we see these ideas being tested, adapted, sometimes betrayed, but always present, shaping how people understood themselves and their world. Medieval world and quiet continuity. The centuries following the classical age saw the rise and fall of some of history's greatest empires. Alexander the Great, a student of Aristotle, conquered most of the known world from Greece to Egypt to India by the time he died at 32 in 323 BC. His conquests spread Greek culture throughout this vast territory, creating what historians call the Hellenistic world, where Greek ideas mixed with local traditions to create new hybrid cultures. In Egypt, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled in the Greek manner but adopted Egyptian customs. In Bactria and northern India, Greek kings minted coins with images of Greek gods on one side and Indian deities on the other. But Alexander's empire fragmented upon his death, divided among his generals. The world he had briefly united returned to competing kingdoms. Yet something had changed permanently. The walls between civilizations had become more porous. Ideas and goods flowed more freely. In the great library of Alexandria in Egypt, scholars translated texts from Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, and other languages, attempting to collect all human knowledge in one place. Mathematicians like Euclid systematized geometry. Scientists like Archimedes discovered principles of physics and engineering. It was an age of learning and synthesis. To the west, Rome was rising. What began as a small city-state in central Italy gradually conquered the entire Mediterranean world, creating an empire that would last, in one form or another, for over 1,000 years. The Romans were practical people, more interested in engineering and law than philosophy, though they absorbed and preserved Greek culture even as they conquered Greek territories. They built roads that connected their empire, roads so well constructed that some are still in use today. They built aqueducts to bring water to cities, public baths, amphitheaters, and forums. Roman law became increasingly sophisticated, establishing principles like the presumption of innocence and the right to legal defense. Roman citizenship, initially limited to people from Rome itself, gradually expanded to include people throughout the empire. At its height under emperors like Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia, from North Africa to the Rhine and Danube rivers. It was the largest and most powerful state Europe would see until modern times. For ordinary people in the Roman Empire, life was relatively stable. There was the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, enforced by the legions but allowing trade and travel to flourish. A merchant could ship grain from Egypt to Rome or wine from Gaul to Britain with reasonable confidence that pirates would be suppressed and roads would be maintained. Cities thrived, especially in the East, with populations reaching sizes that wouldn't be seen again in Europe until the modern era. Rome itself had over 1 million inhabitants, supplied with grain from Egypt and North Africa, entertained with gladiatorial games and chariot races. But the empire also had its dark sides. It was built on slavery, with millions of enslaved people working in mines, on farms, in households, and in workshops. Inequality was extreme, with a small aristocracy controlling vast wealth while many free citizens lived in poverty. The famous bread and circuses, free grain and entertainment, were not kindness but social control, keeping the urban poor pacified. And the empire's expansion had been brutal, with countless people killed, enslaved, or displaced in Rome's wars of conquest. In the 1st century CE, a new religion emerged from the eastern provinces of the empire. In the Roman province of Judea, a Jewish teacher named Jesus of Nazareth began preaching a message of love, forgiveness, and the coming kingdom of God. He drew followers, healed the sick, challenged religious authorities, and was eventually executed by crucifixion around 30 CE. His followers claimed he had risen from the dead and was the promised Messiah. They began spreading his teachings, first among Jews and then increasingly among Gentiles as well. Christianity, as this new religion came to be called, spread throughout the Roman Empire despite periodic persecutions. It offered something compelling, a promise of salvation to all regardless of social status, a community of mutual support, a clear ethical code, and hope for an afterlife. By the 4th century CE, Christianity had become so widespread that the Emperor Constantine converted and eventually made it the empire's official religion. The persecuted sect had become the imperial church. Meanwhile, far to the east, China was experiencing its own cycles of unity and fragmentation. After centuries of warfare, the Qin dynasty had unified China in 221 BCE, but it lasted only 14 years, brought down by its own harshness. The Han dynasty that followed ruled for 4 centuries, establishing a pattern that would last for 2 millennia. A centralized bureaucratic state, unified by Confucian ideology, governed by educated officials selected through examinations, maintained by a complex system of laws and regulations. The Han dynasty expanded China's borders, opening the Silk Road that connected China to Central Asia, India, Persia, and eventually Rome. Along these routes traveled silk and spices, jade and precious metals, but also ideas and religions. Buddhism entered China from India, gradually adapting to Chinese culture and merging with Taoist and Confucian concepts to create distinctive Chinese forms like Chan, Zen, Buddhism. But the Han dynasty also fell, fragmenting into competing kingdoms in the 3rd century CE. China entered a long period of division, yet Chinese culture continued to develop. Poetry flourished. Landscape painting emerged as an art form. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning. When China reunified under the Sui and then the Tang dynasty in the 6th and 7th centuries, it entered what many consider its golden age, a period of cosmopolitan sophistication, religious tolerance, and cultural achievement. In India, the Mauryan Empire had briefly unified much of the subcontinent under Ashoka in the 3rd century BC. Ashoka, after conquering much territory through bloody warfare, converted to Buddhism and tried to rule according to Buddhist principles of nonviolence and compassion. He erected pillars throughout his empire inscribed with edicts promoting ethical behavior and religious tolerance. After the Mauryan collapse, India fragmented again into many kingdoms, but culture and religion continued to develop. The great Hindu epics, the Mahabharata and Ramayana, reached their final forms. Hindu philosophy matured, and magnificent temples were built. In the Americas, civilizations continued to rise independently. The Maya reached their classic period, building cities with towering pyramids in the jungles of Guatemala and the Yucatan. They developed the most sophisticated writing system in the pre-Columbian Americas and made astronomical observations of remarkable precision, tracking the movements of Venus and predicting eclipses. Their mathematics included the concept of zero, discovered independently of the Old World. But the Maya were not unified. They were city-states that competed and fought, formed alliances and betrayed each other, much like the Greek city-states. In central Mexico, Teotihuacan grew to become one of the largest cities in the world, with massive pyramids to the sun and moon, apartment compounds housing tens of thousands of people, and trade networks extending throughout Mesoamerica. We don't know what language the people of Teotihuacan spoke or what they called themselves. Even the city's name is Aztec, given centuries after the city was abandoned. Around 550 CE, Teotihuacan collapsed, perhaps due to internal strife or climate change, and was left to the elements. In South America, complex societies continued to develop in the Andes. The Moche on the north coast of Peru built impressive pyramids of adobe brick and created some of the most sophisticated pottery in the ancient world, with realistic portraits and scenes of daily life and ritual. The Nazca in southern Peru created the famous Nazca lines, enormous geoglyphs visible only from the air, whose purpose remains debated. By the middle of the first millennium CE, the classical civilizations of the Old World were entering their twilight. The Roman Empire, weakened by internal problems and pressure from migrating peoples, split into eastern and western halves. The Western Empire gradually fragmented and finally fell in 476 CE when the last Roman emperor was deposed. The Eastern Empire, centered on Constantinople, continued as the Byzantine Empire, preserving Roman law and Greek culture, converting Slavic peoples to Christianity, and defending against Persian and later Arab invasions. Western Europe entered what was once called the Dark Ages, though modern historians prefer to call it the early medieval period, recognizing that it was not as dark as once thought. Life was certainly harder than during the Roman peace. Trade declined, cities shrank, literacy decreased. Political authority fragmented into countless small kingdoms and principalities. But it was not entirely a time of chaos. Monasteries preserved literacy and learning. Missionaries spread Christianity to Germanic and Celtic peoples. New kingdoms took shape: the Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths in Spain, the Lombards in Italy. In Arabia, in the 7th century, another new religion emerged. Muhammad, a merchant from Mecca, received revelations that he believed came from God through the angel Gabriel. These revelations, compiled into the Quran, taught strict monotheism, social justice, and submission to God's will. Islam means submission. Muhammad preached against the polytheism of Arabian society and called for care of the poor and vulnerable. Opposed by Mecca's elite, he and his followers fled to Medina in 622 CE, an event called the Hijra that marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. From Medina, Muhammad unified the Arabian tribes under Islam and eventually conquered Mecca. After his death in 632, his successors, the caliphs, led Arab armies in a wave of conquests that was stunning in speed and scope. Within a century, Islamic rule extended from Spain to Central Asia, from North Africa to the borders of China and India. The Byzantine and Persian empires were shattered. A new civilization was born. Islamic civilization became a bridge between East and West, North and South. Muslim scholars translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, preserving them during a time when they were largely forgotten in Europe. They translated Sanskrit texts from India and Pahlavi texts from Persia. They made original contributions in mathematics, developing algebra, astronomy, medicine, optics, and philosophy. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became centers of learning where Muslims, Christians, and Jews worked together, debating and building on each other's ideas. Trade flourished across the Islamic world. Merchants traveled from Spain to China, from East Africa to Indonesia, spreading not just goods but also ideas and technologies. The Islamic world was cosmopolitan and sophisticated, with high standards of living, advanced agriculture, introducing crops and irrigation techniques throughout their territories, and flourishing arts and architecture. The great mosques they built, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, the Great Mosque of Damascus, the Mosque of Cordoba, were masterpieces of architecture and decoration. As the centuries passed, the medieval world settled into patterns that would last for hundreds of years. In Europe, feudalism provided a degree of order. Land was held by lords who provided protection and justice to peasants who worked the land. Castles dotted the landscape, centers of local power. The Catholic Church provided unity and structure, with monasteries and cathedrals in every region, all acknowledging the authority of the Pope in Rome. Life was local. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born, but there were connections across larger distances through pilgrimage routes, trade fairs, and the networks of monasteries and universities. Universities emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries, first in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, then spreading across Europe. Students came from all over to study theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. Latin was the common language of learning, allowing scholars to communicate across national boundaries. Thomas Aquinas synthesized Christian theology with Aristotelian philosophy. Roger Bacon advocated for experimental science. The high medieval period was intellectually vibrant, not the dark, ignorant time popular imagination often suggests. In China, the Song dynasty presided over another golden age from 960 to 1279. The Chinese economy boomed. Technological innovations like the printing press, gunpowder, and the magnetic compass either originated or were perfected in China. Urbanization increased dramatically. The capital, Kaifeng, had over 1 million inhabitants. Chinese ships traded across the Indian Ocean. Neo-Confucianism emerged, incorporating Buddhist and Taoist insights into Confucian philosophy, creating a new synthesis that would dominate Chinese thought for centuries. In the Islamic world, after the initial period of rapid expansion and centralized rule, political fragmentation set in. The caliphate weakened, and regional dynasties asserted independence, though cultural and religious unity remained strong. Then came the Mongols, bursting out of Central Asia in the 13th century under Genghis Khan and his successors, conquering the largest land empire in history. They destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate, sacked Baghdad, conquered Russia and much of Eastern Europe, and established the Yuan dynasty in China. The destruction was immense, with countless cities razed and populations decimated. Yet the Mongol Empire also created connections. The Pax Mongolica allowed trade and travel across Asia with unprecedented security. Marco Polo's journey from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan was possible because of Mongol rule. Ideas and technologies flowed along the Silk Road. Printing and gunpowder traveled west from China to the Islamic world and Europe, while Persian and European ideas traveled east. The Mongol Empire eventually fragmented, but it had transformed Eurasian history, connecting regions that had been relatively isolated. Through all these centuries, for ordinary people, life followed its timeless rhythms. Farmers planted and harvested, following the seasons. They lived in villages, in small houses of wood or mud brick, with dirt floors and thatched roofs. They ate bread and porridge, vegetables from their gardens, occasionally meat. They worked from dawn to dusk during harvest season, had more leisure in winter. They were born, grew up, married, had children, grew old and died, usually within a few miles of where they were born. Religion structured their lives. Church bells or the call to prayer marked the hours. Saints' days and religious festivals provided breaks from labor and opportunities for celebration. The church, mosque, or temple was usually the largest and finest building in the community, a reminder that there were forces larger than the everyday, that life had meaning and purpose beyond mere survival. Knowledge was passed down orally, stories and songs, farming techniques, craft skills, herbal remedies. Most people were illiterate, but that didn't mean they were ignorant. They possessed deep practical knowledge of their environment and their trades. They participated in a rich oral culture of epic poems, folk tales, and ballads. They lived in a world that was smaller in geographic scope but perhaps richer in personal relationships and community life than our modern world. Yet this world was slowly changing. Trade was expanding, connecting distant regions. Technologies were improving, better plows, windmills and watermills, improved ship designs. Cities were growing, becoming centers of commerce and craft production. Money was becoming more important, replacing barter and service obligations. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the medieval world was being transformed. setting the stage for the dramatic changes that would come in the centuries ahead. Age of discovery and change. As the 15th century dawned, the world was on the cusp of transformation. The medieval order, which had provided stability for centuries, was beginning to crack. New ideas were stirring, new technologies were developing, and soon, the maps themselves would be redrawn as Europeans ventured across oceans to encounter civilizations they hadn't known existed. The Renaissance began in Italy, in wealthy cities like Florence, Venice, and Rome. Renaissance means rebirth, and it was seen as a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman culture. Wealthy merchants and bankers, like the Medici family in Florence, patronized artists, scholars, and architects. There was a renewed interest in the human form, in nature, in the achievements of the ancient world. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo created works of stunning beauty and technical mastery. Humanist scholars studied classical texts, not just for their theological implications but for their insights into human nature and society. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, revolutionized the spread of information. Before this, books were copied by hand, making them rare and expensive. With the printing press, books could be produced in quantity, making knowledge more accessible. The first major work Gutenberg printed was the Bible, but soon printing presses were producing all kinds of texts: classical works, scientific treatises, political pamphlets, popular literature. Literacy began to increase. Ideas could spread faster and farther than ever before. In 1492, Christopher Columbus, an Italian navigator sailing under the Spanish flag, crossed the Atlantic Ocean seeking a western route to Asia. Instead, he encountered the Caribbean islands and, on subsequent voyages, the coasts of Central and South America. He didn't know he had found continents unknown to Europeans. He died believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. But his voyages opened an era of European exploration and colonization that would transform the world. Other explorers followed. Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to reach India, establishing a sea route that would make Portugal wealthy from the spice trade. Ferdinand Magellan's expedition circumnavigated the globe, proving definitively that the Earth was round and providing a sense of its actual size. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro encountered and conquered the Aztec and Inca empires, two of the most sophisticated civilizations in the Americas, toppling them in a few short years through a combination of superior military technology, alliances with disaffected subjects, and, most devastatingly, epidemic diseases. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and the New, transformed both hemispheres. Europeans brought wheat, horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep to the Americas. They also brought smallpox, measles, typhus, and other diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity. The demographic collapse was catastrophic. In some areas, up to 90% of the indigenous population died within a century of contact. Entire civilizations were devastated, not by warfare alone but by microbes against which they had no defense. From the Americas to Europe came maize, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao, tobacco, and many other crops. Potatoes and maize, in particular, would transform agriculture in Europe, Asia, and Africa, supporting population growth. But the exchange also included the forced migration of millions of enslaved Africans to work on plantations in the Americas, producing sugar, tobacco, and later cotton for European markets. The Atlantic slave trade was one of history's greatest crimes, tearing apart families and communities, causing immeasurable suffering, and having effects that persist to this day. The age of exploration was driven by a mix of motives: desire for wealth, curiosity about the world, competition between European powers, and a desire to spread Christianity. It led to European colonization of much of the world, with profound and often devastating consequences for indigenous peoples. Yet it also created a truly global exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultures for the first time in history. The world was becoming interconnected in ways it had never been before. Back in Europe, religious upheaval was shaking the continent. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published his 95 Theses, criticizing practices of the Catholic Church, particularly the sale of indulgences, payments that were supposed to reduce punishment for sins. Luther believed that salvation came through faith alone, not through good works or church rituals, and that the Bible, not church tradition, was the ultimate authority. His ideas spread rapidly, thanks in part to the printing press. The Protestant Reformation split Western Christianity. Numerous Protestant denominations emerged: Lutherans in Germany and Scandinavia, Reformed churches in Switzerland and the Netherlands, Anglicans in England. The Catholic Church responded with the Counter-Reformation, reforming some practices, reaffirming traditional doctrines, and founding new religious orders like the Jesuits to spread the faith. Religious conflict plagued Europe for over a century, culminating in the devastating 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which killed millions. But the questioning of traditional authorities extended beyond religion. The scientific revolution began to challenge ancient views of the natural world. Copernicus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, not the other way around, contradicting both common sense and church teaching. Galileo, using the newly invented telescope, provided evidence supporting this heliocentric model and discovered that celestial bodies were not perfect and unchanging as Aristotle had taught. He was forced by the Inquisition to recant, but his discoveries couldn't be undone. Isaac Newton synthesized the work of earlier scientists into a comprehensive system. His laws of motion and universal gravitation explained everything from falling apples to planetary orbits. His work suggested that the universe operated according to mathematical laws that could be discovered through observation and experiment. This mechanistic view of nature was both thrilling and unsettling. It suggested a cosmos that ran like clockwork, with less need for direct divine intervention. The Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries took these scientific principles and applied them to society. Enlightenment thinkers believed in the power of reason to improve human life. They questioned traditional authorities, monarchies, aristocracies, established churches, and argued for natural rights, religious tolerance, and government based on the consent of the governed. John Locke argued that people had natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that government existed to protect these rights. Voltaire championed freedom of thought and speech. Rousseau explored the nature of the social contract between rulers and ruled. These ideas had revolutionary consequences. The American Revolution, 1776, established a republic based on Enlightenment principles, declaring that all men are created equal with unalienable rights. The French Revolution, 1789, overthrew the monarchy and attempted to create a society based on liberty, equality, and fraternity, though it descended into violence and eventually dictatorship under Napoleon. But the ideas didn't die. Throughout the 19th century, they inspired movements for democracy, nationalism, and human rights around the world. Meanwhile, other parts of the world were following their own trajectories. The Ottoman Empire controlled much of the Middle East, North Africa, and southeastern Europe, maintaining a sophisticated administration and a cosmopolitan culture where Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived alongside each other, though not always harmoniously. The Mughal Empire in India created a synthesis of Persian, Islamic, and Indian cultures, building magnificent monuments like the Taj Mahal. The Ming and then Qing dynasties ruled China, which remained the world's largest economy and most populous country. But Europe was gaining power. European ships, carrying more advanced weapons and navigational tools, dominated the seas. European merchants established trading posts and colonies around the world. European diseases continued to devastate populations without immunity. European ideas about science, government, and economics were spreading. The balance of power was shifting, though this wasn't yet fully apparent. In the Americas, European colonies were developing. Spanish and Portuguese colonies in Central and South America were built on the exploitation of indigenous and African slave labor, extracting gold and silver in quantities that flooded European markets and caused inflation. British and French colonies in North America grew more slowly but steadily, with settlers clearing forests and establishing farms, pushing indigenous peoples ever westward. These colonies would eventually become nations in their own right, forever changing the global balance of power. The world was becoming more connected but also more divided. European empires were carving up Africa, Asia, and the Pacific among themselves. They justified this through ideologies of racial superiority and a civilizing mission, claiming they were bringing progress and Christianity to backward peoples. The reality was often brutal exploitation. Forced labor, seized land, destroyed cultures, shattered societies. Resistance was constant but often crushed. Some societies managed to adapt and maintain independence. Japan, for instance, deliberately modernized to avoid colonization, but most fell under European control. Yet even as European power reached its zenith, the seeds of its eventual decline were being sown. The ideas of equality and rights that Europeans promoted at home were embraced by colonized peoples, who began to ask, if all men are created equal, why are we not free? Nationalism, which Europeans used to build their own nation-states, inspired independence movements in the colonies. The technologies that gave Europeans advantages, railroads, telegraphs, modern weapons, gradually spread to other societies. The world was becoming more equal, not in the sense that everyone lived equally well, but in the sense that the tools and ideas that had made Europe powerful were becoming globally available. Industry, machines, and modern life. In the late 18th century, in Britain, something new began. A series of inventions and innovations, building on each other, transformed how goods were produced. The spinning jenny and power loom mechanized textile production. The steam engine, perfected by James Watt, provided a new source of power that didn't depend on wind, water, or muscle. Iron and later steel could be produced in large quantities, enabling the construction of machines, bridges, and eventually railroads. This was the Industrial Revolution, and it changed everything. Factories emerged, concentrating workers and machines in cities. Production increased dramatically. Goods that had taken days to make by hand could now be produced in hours. Prices fell, making manufactured goods accessible to more people. But there were costs. Factory work was harsh, long hours, dangerous conditions, low pay. Cities grew rapidly, often becoming overcrowded and polluted. Child labor was common. The gap between rich and poor widened. Workers began to organize, forming unions to demand better conditions, leading to conflicts between labor and capital that would define much of modern politics. Railroads shrank distance. Journeys that had taken days or weeks could now be made in hours. Goods could be transported quickly and cheaply, creating national and international markets. Telegraph lines allowed nearly instantaneous communication across vast distances. The world was speeding up. Information that once took weeks to travel now moved in seconds. Decisions could be made faster. The pace of life accelerated. The Industrial Revolution spread from Britain to continental Europe, to North America, and eventually to other parts of the world. Industrialization brought enormous increases in wealth and power to those nations that adopted it. They could produce more goods, field larger armies equipped with better weapons, and project power globally. Non-industrialized societies found themselves at an increasing disadvantage, often becoming targets for colonization or economic exploitation. New ideologies emerged to make sense of these changes. Capitalism, with its emphasis on free markets, private property, and competition, became the dominant economic system in industrializing nations. Socialists and later communists, led by thinkers like Karl Marx, argued that capitalism was inherently exploitative, enriching owners while impoverishing workers. They called for workers to seize control of the means of production and create a more equal society. These competing visions would drive much of the conflict in the 20th century. Science continued its march. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection explained the diversity of life without invoking divine creation, further challenging traditional religious views. Mendel's work on genetics laid the foundation for understanding heredity. Pasteur and Koch established the germ theory of disease, revolutionizing medicine and public health. Anesthesia and antiseptic surgery made operations safer. Vaccines prevented deadly diseases. Average lifespans began to increase dramatically in industrialized nations. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the Second Industrial Revolution. Electricity lit up cities and powered new machines. The internal combustion engine led to automobiles and airplanes, revolutionizing transportation yet again. Chemical industries produced fertilizers that increased agricultural yields, plastics that created new materials, and later, synthetic fibers and pharmaceuticals. Mass production techniques, like Henry Ford's assembly line, made complex goods affordable to ordinary people. This period also saw the rise of mass media. Newspapers became cheap and widely available, creating informed publics but also enabling propaganda. Photography and later cinema captured and disseminated images. Radio brought voices and music into homes. People were more connected to events around the world, more aware of how others lived, more influenced by distant events and ideas. Nationalism intensified. Nations competed for colonies, for prestige, for power. Alliances formed. Tensions rose. In 1914, these tensions exploded into the First World War. What began as a relatively minor dispute in the Balkans escalated due to alliance systems and mobilization schedules into a global conflict. The war was devastating. Millions died in brutal trench warfare. Poison gas, machine guns, and artillery turned battlefields into hellscapes. The old certainties, that progress was inevitable, that civilization was advancing, that European culture was superior, shattered in the mud of the Somme and Verdun. The war ended in 1918, but the peace was troubled. The Treaty of Versailles imposed harsh terms on Germany, breeding resentment. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and Russian empires collapsed, redrawn into new nations that often grouped together antagonistic peoples or divided cohesive groups. The League of Nations was founded to prevent future wars, but it lacked enforcement power. Meanwhile, the 1918 influenza pandemic killed more people than the war itself, demonstrating that even modern medicine had limits. The Russian Revolution of 1917 brought communists to power, creating the Soviet Union, the world's first avowedly Marxist state. The Soviets promised a workers' paradise, equality, and an end to exploitation. The reality was often harsh: forced collectivization, purges, gulags, but the Soviet Union also achieved rapid industrialization and provided education and healthcare to millions. It offered an alternative model to capitalism, inspiring communist movements worldwide and leading to decades of Cold War between communist and capitalist blocs. The 1920s in the West were a time of prosperity and cultural ferment: jazz, flappers, Art Deco, the Harlem Renaissance. But this ended with the Great Depression, which began with the 1929 stock market crash and spread globally. Unemployment soared. Banks failed. Trade collapsed. Millions suffered. The Depression discredited laissez-faire capitalism and led to greater government intervention in economies, exemplified by Roosevelt's New Deal in the United States. The Depression also helped extremist movements gain power. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, promising to restore German greatness. They blamed Germany's problems on the Versailles Treaty and on scapegoats, particularly Jews. In Italy, Mussolini's fascists had already taken power. In Japan, militarists gained control. These authoritarian, nationalist, and in Germany's case, racist regimes rejected democracy and international cooperation, embracing instead militarism and expansion. The Second World War, 1939 to 1945, was even more devastating than the first. It was a truly global conflict fought in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. It saw the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed undesirable by the Nazis. It saw the use of atomic weapons, which killed hundreds of thousands instantly and ushered in an age where humanity possessed the means for its own annihilation. The war ended with the defeat of fascism, but at an almost incomprehensible cost: somewhere between 70 and 85 million people dead. The post-war world was divided between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The Cold War, a state of tension and proxy conflicts without direct war between the superpowers, would define global politics for nearly 50 years. Both sides built enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons, creating a balance of terror where neither could attack the other without ensuring mutual destruction. Yet they competed globally, militarily, economically, culturally, and in space. Decolonization swept the world. European empires, weakened by 2 world wars and facing independence movements inspired by nationalism and Enlightenment ideals, granted or were forced to grant independence to their colonies. India, Indonesia, most of Africa, and many other territories became independent nations. This process was sometimes peaceful but often violent. The newly independent nations faced enormous challenges: artificial borders drawn by colonizers, economies structured to serve imperial needs, ethnic and religious divisions, lack of infrastructure and education. Many became battlegrounds in the Cold War, receiving aid and interference from both superpowers. The late 20th century saw remarkable changes. Technology advanced at an accelerating pace. Computers, once room-sized machines, became desktop devices and then portable ones. The Internet connected the world in ways unimaginable before, allowing instant communication and access to information. Medicine continued its progress. Vaccines eliminated smallpox entirely, antibiotics cured once deadly infections, Surgical techniques saved lives that would have been lost in earlier eras. The Green Revolution increased agricultural productivity using new crop varieties, fertilizers, and irrigation to feed growing populations. World population exploded from about 1 billion in 1800 to 2.5 billion in 1950 to over 6 billion by 2000, raising concerns about sustainability but also demonstrating humanity's remarkable ability to expand food production. Social movements challenged old hierarchies. The civil rights movement in the United States and similar movements elsewhere fought against racial discrimination. Women's movements pushed for equality, gaining rights to vote, own property, pursue education and careers, and control their own bodies. LGBTQ movements fought for recognition and rights. Environmental movements raised awareness about pollution, habitat destruction, and climate change, leading to new regulations and conservation efforts. The Cold War ended with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, a largely peaceful revolution that saw communist regimes in Eastern Europe fall and the USSR itself dissolve. For a brief moment, it seemed democracy and capitalism had triumphed definitively. But new challenges emerged: ethnic conflicts, terrorism, economic inequality, environmental degradation. The world was more interconnected than ever, with global trade, instant communication, and shared culture, but also more aware of its problems and divisions. The present and a quiet reflection. And so we arrive at our own time, the early 21st century, a moment in history that we're still living and still creating. The pace of change continues to accelerate. Technologies that were science fiction a generation ago, smartphones, social media, artificial intelligence, gene editing, are now everyday realities. We are more connected than any previous generation, able to communicate instantly with people anywhere on Earth, to access nearly all human knowledge from a device in our pocket. Yet we face challenges that earlier generations could not have imagined. Climate change, driven by our burning of fossil fuels, threatens to disrupt ecosystems and human societies. The very success of industrial civilization in providing energy and goods has altered Earth's atmosphere and climate. We're in what some call the Anthropocene, a geological epoch defined by human impact on the planet. Species are going extinct at rates not seen since the age of dinosaurs ended. Plastic pollution fills oceans. The question of our time is whether we can adjust our civilization to live sustainably, or whether we will degrade the systems that support us. We live in a world of about 8 billion people, the vast majority living in cities, a complete reversal from just a century ago when most people lived in rural areas. These cities glow at night, visible from space, webs of light covering continents. People live longer, healthier lives than ever before in most parts of the world. Infant mortality has plummeted. Literacy has spread. Extreme poverty, while still too common, has decreased dramatically. By many measures, this is the best time to be alive in human history. Yet inequality remains vast, both within and between nations. The wealthiest possess more than they could spend in 1,000 lifetimes, while others struggle for basic necessities. Political divisions seem to be widening in many places, with people retreating into echo chambers that reinforce their existing beliefs. Misinformation spreads as quickly as truth. Ancient prejudices, racism, sexism, xenophobia, persist even as we claim to have moved beyond them. We are more connected yet in some ways more isolated, communicating through screens rather than face-to-face. We have access to more entertainment than we could ever consume, yet often feel bored or restless. We have technologies that previous generations would have seen as magic, yet we're not obviously happier than our ancestors. Perhaps we're learning that material progress doesn't automatically translate to spiritual or emotional fulfillment, that the human heart wants more than just comfort and convenience. The story of human civilization is a long one, spanning hundreds of thousands of years from those first campfires under African skies to the glowing screens of today. It's a story of remarkable creativity and terrible cruelty, of cooperation and conflict, of wisdom and foolishness. We've built wonders and committed atrocities. We've created art that moves the soul and weapons that can end all life. We've developed philosophies that seek peace and ideologies that justify violence. Looking back across this vast sweep of time, certain patterns emerge. Civilizations rise and fall. They grow complex and sophisticated, then collapse or transform. Knowledge accumulates, is sometimes lost, then rediscovered or reinvented. Technologies advance, usually improving material conditions but often with unintended consequences. Ideas spread and evolve, mixing with other ideas to create new syntheses. Power shifts from one group or region to another. What seems permanent and inevitable in one era appears fragile and contingent in retrospect. But there are also constants. People everywhere and always have wanted safety, sufficiency, connection, meaning. They've wanted to protect and provide for their families. They've wanted to be part of something larger than themselves. They've asked the same fundamental questions. Who am I? How should I live? What happens when I die? What is real and true and good? These questions don't have final answers, but each generation must grapple with them anew. The people of the past were not fundamentally different from us. The hunters following game across the savannah, the farmers planting wheat along the Nile, the philosophers debating in Athens, the monks copying manuscripts, the merchants sailing to distant lands, the factory workers demanding better conditions, the soldiers in muddy trenches, the activists marching for rights. All of them had hopes and fears, dreams and disappointments, moments of joy and sorrow. They loved and hated, laughed and cried, struggled and endured. They were us, separated only by time. And we are creating history right now. Future generations, if there are future generations, will look back on our time and see patterns we can't yet perceive. They'll judge us by how we handled our challenges, by whether we acted with wisdom or folly, compassion or cruelty. They'll be amazed by some things we accomplished and appalled by others. They'll struggle to understand why we did what we did, just as we struggle to understand our ancestors. They'll recognize themselves in us, as we recognize ourselves in those who came before. The great sweep of human history is both humbling and inspiring. Humbling because we see how brief our individual lives are in the grand scheme, how many have come before us and how many will come after. Inspiring because we see what humans have accomplished, how far we've come from those first simple stone tools, how much we've learned and created and built. We stand on the shoulders of countless generations, benefiting from their labor and their discoveries, their struggles and their sacrifices.